about the Herods. But to start, let me ask you a simple question. How are you like your parents? How are you not like your parents? It's a tricky question. Nobody wants to fail. I can't tell if that's confession or what, but you know, I'll let you decide that. She had a word for it. Okay, well, yeah, yeah, really. You start to look like your parents, sound like your parents. That's even worse. You hear your own voice and you suddenly sound like somebody that's from your distant past. Anything else? How is that? Okay, you're different but the same. That's it's interesting. Now, our daughter was a fun kid growing up, but a challenge to raise. And so she now has two kids that are fun kids and a challenge to raise. I just grin when things happen because they are taking after her so much that I can just watch all this play out the way it ought to. The interesting thing is that that's not an idle question for a lot of reasons. Uh, there's a phrase that says like father, like son, and that is true about so many things, not just about physical traits, not just about how you go about your life. It can have to be moral and ethical things as well. Just think about the story of Abraham. Abraham lies about his wife twice, both times before he has a son. But his son lies about his wife once, and his son is named supplanter, which means deceiver. Everybody has a problem with the truth in that family. Like father, like son. It's an interesting study. Of several years ago, I had a, in fact, I kept a book when I got rid of most of my books because it's so fascinating. But it's a book about family traits and in counseling. Think about this for a moment. In the Kennedy family, you know what's the problem in the Kennedy family? All of the men have affairs, starting with daddy, the sons, the grandsons, the great grandsons, or the Fondas. You know Henry Fonda, his daughter Jane. He had a brother. You know what their problem is? They all commit suicide. There's been 12 suicides in that family. Think that doesn't run in the family somehow? Today we're going to talk about somebody who has, we're talking some people who have taken on the traits of a father. We're going to start here with Herod Antipas. Now, just a brief recap of last week's lesson. I mean, very brief. Uh, we talked about Herod the Great last week. Terrible human being, uh, but he was prolific in so many ways. He built the temple of Jerusalem on the belief that he was the new Solomon, that destined to become the heir of the throne, as God intended. But at the same time, he cruelly killed all these children when Jesus was born because of a problem with power. You're going to find that trait kind of coming out along the way tonight. And the first is with Antipas, reminder of family history. We started last week. He came to power in Judea sometime about 40 years before Jesus was born. He died shortly after Jesus was born. He had four sons, Aristobulus, that we know very little about, Philip, that we're going to touch on in just a moment, Archelaus, that we talked about last week, who was such a tyrant that finally the Romans got rid of him, and then Herod Antipas. Herod, you may not know Herod Antipas by that name. We usually just know him as Herod, but you have to call him Antipas to keep him straight. It's kind of like a baseball game. You can't tell the players without a program. And so Herod Antipas is the Herod that we think about during the ministry of Jesus. And we're going to return to him because of his kids. But when Archelaus made such a mess of the kingdom, and the Jews went to Rome and they said, we can't stand this guy. You're going to have to get rid of him. And they withdrew him. They turned this all into what was called a tetrarchy. In other words, there are four kingdoms. There was Judea, which was no longer in control of anybody but the Romans. They had it with Herods running that part. But the purple part up here, Galilee and Perea, went to Herod Antipas. This area in orange, if you will, belonged to Philip. Now, they had a sister that was in these little areas that didn't account to much. And so when we talk about things tonight, we're talking about this area with Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was he took after his father in a lot of ways. He was ruler over Galilee and Perea. He had a single mandate. When Archelaus made such a mess with the Jews that they complained to get rid of him, the Romans said, well, you can be in charge of that area under one condition. You keep the Jews happy and maintain order. Meaning, we don't want another delegation coming over here to Rome to tattle on the guy that we put in charge because we'll get rid of you like we got rid of everybody else. Do you understand? I mean, that's kind of the short answer to that. And so that was what he was given as a task to do. He saw himself much like his father. He thought of himself as a great builder. And so he began to take on building concepts. One of them was at Sepphoris. Now, Sepphoris is a place, let me go backwards because I'm not there yet. Sepphoris is up here. Sea of Galilee is here. Gennesareth, Gennesaret, which is where the demon-possessed man went and Jesus cast the demons into the pig. You've got Cana up here where Jesus cast out, where he made the water into wine. Nain, where he raised the widow's son from the dead. Nazareth, and between Nazareth and Cana is Sepphoris. The interesting thing about Sepphoris is that Sepphoris he built a synagogue for the Jews. Now, if you're trying to maintain order and you're trying to calm everybody down, you do something nice for them. So he built a synagogue. It has been excavated, and this is it. Just to give us an interesting idea of what synagogue was like, you had these benches on the side where people would sit, and where the main speaker or the rabbi would be here, and then slaves and others sit on the floor. That's what gives James his potency when he writes about, in his letter, about making the poor man sit in the corner, if you will. In other words, they sit in the dirt at the dirty feet of the rich man. Jesus probably came to the synagogue at some point in time. He was very familiar with it. It's right up the road. He would be places all over. Tiberias, Capernaum, Cana. He would have had to have gone here. And this was built by Herod Antipas, which sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Until you read the rest of the story. He's got marital issues. His brother Philip had a wife whose name Herodias. He visited Philip and his wife Herodias in Rome once. And while there, apparently Herodias and Herod Antipas had a tryst. It's a nice way of saying things, isn't it? A tryst. So much so that he goes back home. He divorces his wife, who is the princess of Aretas, starts a war by doing that, by the way, and then steals Philip's wife away from him. He marries his sister-in-law. How'd you like to be at that Thanksgiving party? Just think about what that meant. Philip never does marry again. He dies childless, and he's never heard of anymore. All because of Antipas. And so when he marries Herodias, things begin to happen. Herodias is a, how shall I say, manipulative shrew. That's the nice way of saying it. At least it's a nice way in church to say it. But she's a manipulative shrew, and she can get what she wants when she wants it from whoever she wants it. And so we come to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew 14, John the Baptist has been put in prison. Herod puts him in prison for a lot of reasons. Primary one was because John was being openly critical of the king, something you don't do. He was telling it the way it was, that he was a sinner to the Jews, he was immoral to the pagans, he was wrong in the sight of God, and he was going to get it in the end. Not exactly diplomatic. And so it says, because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, John had been put in prison. He bound him and put him to prison because John kept saying, it's not lawful for you to have her. One, it's adultery. Two, it's incest. That's hanging territory for Herod. Came awful close. He wanted to kill him. But you remember his charge. He could use half of the same thing was. He could have put a match and dry stubble right there. Just arbitrarily killed him. So instead, he puts him in prison. Because the people consider John to be something of a prophet. Now, it's interesting. This is a coin minted by Herod. And look at the side of the coin. That is, for lack of a better term, a reed. You go to Matthew chapter 11, verse 7. Jesus asked people, what did you come to the desert to see? A reed shaken by the wind? That's really a veiled reference to John the Baptist and his defiance of Herod. Did you think that a bellowing king could change his mind? Do you think he was brave out in public, but then when he got into private, he would be shaken by this wind? Did you go out to see this reed shaken by the wind? You see the reeds on the obverse of the coin. And Jesus uses that image to make his point. John was imprisoned at Machaerus. Now, here's Machaerus. You may remember last week we talked about Herod the Great had a fortress at Masada down by the Dead Sea because he really didn't like to be around people. But if you wanted to get away from everything, you go to the other side of the Dead Sea. And so Machaerus is right here on the banks of the Dead Sea, and this is what it looks like. It's been excavated today. That little hill is not such a little hill. It's a straight up climb of 3,300 feet, almost 3/4 of a mile. When you put somebody at the top of a hill like that, it means two things. No one's going to break you out, and you don't dare escape. Where are you going to go? Down the side of the mountain into the desert where it's 125 degrees? Well, that makes pretty good prison place. That's kind of like the Alcatraz of the ancient Near East. Nobody gets out of there alive. And so John being kept there at that fortress on top of the hill, and probably here in the big banquet hall is where Matthew 14 takes place. Matthew 14 tells of how John met his demise. Herod held this grand banquet to impress all of his guests. And at that banquet, Herodias' daughter from a previous marriage did a seductive dance. I take it as seductive. It doesn't say that, but the reaction says it all. He's wide-eyed and it's glaring. He's leering at this woman, and he's even got stepped on. Isn't that makes your skin crawl? He leers at his stepdaughter. That tells you something about Herod. And he is so overpowering. Whatever you want, I'll give you. She doesn't know what she wants. Like any other teenage girl, what do you want? I don't know. Mom, what should I ask for? Ask for the head of John the Baptist. His pride would not let him say no, lest he be embarrassed. So he had John executed, and his bloody stump of a head brought on a silver platter. It says that his disciples buried him. Then they told Jesus. I always found it interesting that this did not make much of a ripple in Palestine. He was afraid to kill him because he was afraid of what the reaction would be, but he did it out there in Agrippa where nobody did. And the only people who knew were his disciples and Jesus. And so he kind of disappears until he resurrects himself in the story in Luke chapter 23. Luke 23 is the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. You may remember the story in that Jesus is brought, his charges are brought by the Jewish leaders who have no right to execute. So they're going to get Pilate to do it. Pilate is under the same threat as Herod is, maintain order and keep the Jews happy. But how do you get out of that? He didn't think he was guilty. He didn't think Jesus was guilty. Plus that he didn't want to kowtow to the Jewish leaders. How do you get out of that mess? He finds out that Jesus is from Nazareth up in Galilee. Let's have a change of venue of this trial. So he sends him across town to the palace where Herod stays during Passover, thinking that Herod now can pronounce the judgment, and if he gets killed, then I can blame it on Herod. If he doesn't, I can blame it on Herod. It's kind of like every lawyer's play. Anybody but my client. Not my fault. It's everybody else's fault. Problem was, when Jesus goes to Herod, it says that he was happy to see him because he had heard so much about him. But he was looking for a miracle. He's looking for a magic show. And Jesus didn't do tricks. He wasn't a trained monkey. And so he was disappointed. He asked him questions. Jesus wouldn't respond. So he sent him back to Pilate and dumped him back in his lap. And it said, Luke tells us from that time on that Herod and Pilate were friends. They had not been until now. And so he almost disappears from the scene for a good reason. In 39 AD, he and Herodias are exiled de Lyon, France, meaning Gaul, because his brother, the man we're going to get to next, Herod Agrippa I, said he has made so many political connections and so many military connections, which were true, that while Herod Agrippa was back in Rome reporting to the emperor, this comes back to him. And Gaius knows it's true and suspects he's about to have a coup. He's about to run an end run around the government. And so he is accused of being a traitor and plotting treason, so he is sent to exile, never to be seen again. That's in the very early parts of the growth of the church. You never hear about that. What you do hear about is brother Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I was an interesting man in that he was the same and different all at once. He didn't He didn't fit the ruthless killer, but he did. One of the reasons was his thirst for popularity, which gets you always into trouble. Um, Agrippa uh, was the grandson of Herod the Great through Aristobulus. So he was a kind of a brother nephew to uh, the Herod Antipas. It's just when your families aren't clean, you got a real mess. It's kind of like trying to explain to our grandkids that my wife has cousins and she says, how are they related to me? And we say, well, they're the second cousin, fourth removed. After that, you got to have a chart. And that's kind of the way this is. And so Herod Agrippa came to power by being a traitor to his family. The only way he could get power was to get rid of Antipas. And he did that quite well. He was friends. He grew up in Rome as being trained, but one of his friends was a Roman named Caligula. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, bad companions corrupt good morals. That's the story here. Caligula ended up being an emperor of Rome who was so immoral that you cannot really do justice in church talking about him. Homosexual, he was a pedophile, he was a philanderer, he would use someone and then kill them. Years ago, I remember they made a movie called Caligula. It had an X rating and nobody could see it. It was that bad. And so one of his best friends is a guy like this. What do you think is going to happen to him? He's going to turn out bad too. And so he accuses his brother to get the empire, but he likes the Jews as opposed to the rest of the family who tends to say the Jews, well, we'll tolerate them. But that was not Agrippa the First. He really did like the Jews. He learned the law from the Jews. He was a Jew. You would think he would have more affinity for the morals, but he didn't. But he liked the Jews for the order that they brought and for the strict standards they held themselves to. It made his job easier. That's why I liked them, because he still maintained order as well. In Acts chapter 12, we meet him. Now, it's interesting because the text says King Herod. Now, if you've been keeping track, this is the fourth Herod the Bible talks about. And they all talk about King Herod. Well, which Herod is this? This is Herod Agrippa the First. This is the early part of the church, and it says that this tells a story about the very first martyrdom of an apostle. James, the brother of John, is beheaded, and what Herod did was test the winds. Did this play well in Peoria? The answer was yes, it did. Very well. To the point that he said, if it worked once, I'll get it done again. So this time he goes and he gets Peter and he seizes Peter, and he's going to wait until Passover. At the height of Passover, he's going to execute him for all the glory. You know what the problem was? God had other ideas. God sent an angel to the jail the day before he was supposed to be executed, and swung the door open in the middle of the night. And Peter shows up at his house where the Christians are praying. Always like this. Christians are praying and they're shocked to see him. They're praying for his release, but when he's released, they go, "Who are you? A ghost?" I mean, nobody gets out of there, do they? You know, be careful that you pray for something that you don't expect. And that's what they were doing. And so this is foiled and kind of buried in history about what happened. But then you get to the very end and you find out how he died. Scholars have a different take on this, but I think the reason they take it is because they don't like this version. And that tends to be a problem. It says on the appointed day, uh, Herod shows up in bright purple, big royal robe. He sat on the throne. He delivered this great public address. And they shouted, "The voice of a God, not of a man." There's one thing you learn in ministry, and that is be wary of compliments because they're probably not completely true. He took this to heart. He gloried in it. And it says, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel came and struck him down and was eaten by worms and died. Now, historians think they used poison, and that would apply to, he got some sort of parasite. Now, if you've never had anybody with a parasite, maybe the worst thing in the world to have because you can't get rid of it very easy. He was eaten from the inside out, and he died. That's the end of the story. And he doesn't show up much, but he does terrible things and he died all at one time, one chapter. But he has a son, Herod Agrippa II. He did succeed his father. The problem was the Romans were tired of the Herods and their soap opera lifestyle. All the intrigue, all of the backbiting, all of the treachery, all of the stuff. They were tired of it. They didn't like it. They wanted something else to happen. And so they said, you can be king, but you really don't have any power. And so they made him king of a little place just south of Lebanon that didn't have hardly anybody there. And you can wear the title, you just don't have any control. I was reminded of a story that in 1879 there was a man in a small town in Michigan. His name was James Strange. I think that's an appropriate name, frankly. James Strange decided he would become the king of the world. Oh, he pronounced himself king of the world. Did anybody pay attention? No. Did he have anything they could rule over? No. He just wanted to be called king of the world. That was kind of like Agrippa II. He was a king without any power. And he left with the title, but not anything else. The family tree is interesting, as we're going to see in the stories we're going to see in the New Testament. That was Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I has 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, Bernice, Drusilla, and Agrippa II. Keep that in mind as we continue to go through the book of Acts. Because in the book of Acts, something happens. In Acts chapter 24, Paul's on trial. The Jews are going to make this false accusation against him that says, you have brought Gentiles into the temple and desecrated and trying to destroy us. And none of it was true. Half-truths at best, and that's not even much of that. And so, guess who comes to town? The Roman governor, whose name is Felix. Felix has married Drusilla, the sister of Agrippa II and the daughter of Agrippa I. She's married into the Roman power. That's why it says in Acts 24 and verse 24, she was Jewish. Not an idle comment. Trying to alert you to something. That she's on the inside and knows what's going to happen, knows how to talk about this. And so Felix sends for Paul, listens to him. Now, Felix is it's not really about Felix, but to understand the story, you probably need to understand Felix is he's a cad. He apparently sleeps with anything that walks by him and will steal whatever he needs to steal. And so when Paul speaks to him, he talks about righteousness, judgment, and the judgment to come, and morality. And he says, enough for now. I'll call you again sometime. Well, Felix is sent away. He is recalled to Rome. Another one comes in his place. His name is Festus. And so when you get to Acts chapter 25, you've got a new governor, Festus, and he doesn't know what to do with Paul. What do you do with this guy? I don't know anything about this stuff. I don't know anything about the Jews. And so he says, I got to find a Jewish expert here. And it just happened to be in town that Agrippa II and his wife, Bernice, I think is his wife because nobody's really sure. But Bernice was his sister, but probably also connected in other ways, if you will. It appears that Agrippa and Bernice have consorted in a terrible set of situations. And even though they're brother and sister, there's more going on than you think. And so there probably is more to this story than is there. And it's interesting that they appear before Paul, who likes to preach about self-control and judgment. The God puts this preacher in front of the audience they need to speak to. And so you got King Agrippa and Bernice. They arrive at Caesarea. They pay their respects to Festus. And Festus says, why don't you hear this since you know something about this? Because you are familiar with these things. Festus wasn't. And it says, and Festus and Agrippa says, I'd like to talk to him because I've heard some things about this growing group of the Jews called Christians or the Way or whatever they're calling them. And Paul begins to center in on Agrippa II. I'd like you to notice this is the fifth one who comes in contact with somebody in Christianity. Herod the Great was there at the birth of Jesus. Herod Archelaus was there when they bypassed Jerusalem and go to Nazareth. Herod Antipas was there at the trial of Jesus. Herod Agrippa I was there when Peter and James preaching. And now you've got Paul to Agrippa II. The whole family gets to hear the gospel in some way. Paul says, I know you're familiar with all this. And he says, in fact, none of it's been done in a corner. This is not new stuff. This is not secret things. He said, do you believe the prophets? Now, Paul's winding his sermon here. His sermon is, the reason Jesus is Christ is because the prophet said he was, and it's a fulfillment of prophecy. That's kind of his back pocket sermon. And he says, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. And Agrippa picked it up. He said, do you think in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? I know we have that song in the songbook that says almost persuaded, but that's not what this verse says. The songwriter liked it, so he wrote it. We like to sing it, but it's not what the verse says. He says, do you think in such a short time you can bring me to believe in Christ himself? And I remember Paul would say, in short time or long, I wish all men were like me, excepting for my chains. So he heard the gospel as well. He finally has to side with Rome. 70 AD, the Romans had had enough of the Jews. The Roman general Titus was sent to crush the Jewish revolt once and for all. And so Jerusalem was destroyed. In Josephus's history, it talks about what happened, about the legions coming in, and they crowded the entrances to where people were trampled. They couldn't get out. And it says that the partisans were no longer in a position to help. Everywhere there was slaughter and fight. Most of the victims were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, butchered wherever they were caught. Round the altar, the heap of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured rivers of blood, and the bodies of those killed at the top slithered to the bottom. Very graphic explanation. I want you to pay attention around the altar and in the sanctuary. Because Jesus was asked in Matthew chapter 24 about two questions. When is your coming and what are the signs of the end of the age? He answers it he's coy about the end of the age, but he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. He's making an emphasis. When you see what's happening inside the sanctuary, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. What's interesting about that is there's a pretty good chance that Agrippa II was somewhere around Jerusalem during this time. And he witnessed the fact that the grand temple that his grandfather had built was now being burned and destroyed. The great family lineage was dying. He reigns for 47 more years, at least he's called the king, and he finally dies in about 100 AD. He's the only one that lasts very long, by the way. And it was during the time of Domitian. Domitian is the emperor who has the second great persecution of the church in the first century. And so with that, there's an interesting veil that closes. When the New Testament closes, so do the Herods at the same time. Now, I think there's a startling contrast that I think we need to see. I've always liked this. For some reason, when Luke wrote Acts, he made points in very veiled, precise ways. When wickedness ruled, Christianity grew. There's a twist of that. Christianity has been trying to be crushed since its beginning. But every time it gets crushed, it grows. The greatest time of growth of the church has been the persecutions. The least time of growth is when the church has become comfortable. But I like what Luke says. It says, immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he is eaten by a worm, and he died. Next verse. But the word of God continued to spread and flourish. While the great man died, the word continued to flourish. It could not be crushed even by a butcher. But the other is that the greatest structure, the greatest heritage of the Herods was destroyed in 70 AD. But really the true sanctuary has survived. Because Peter in his confession would say, Jesus would say, I build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. The church still survives. There's some stones left over from the first temple. That's about it. That's about the whole remnants of the Herods we got left in the world. What we do have is the truth of God, that is still here as well. The Herods didn't win as much as they thought they might have, because the church is still here today.